Therapist, what made you realize you were treating a sociopath? Story 1. I worked in a locked inpatient psychiatric unit for 5 years. I witnessed many disturbing things, but the most bone-chilling patient I ever encountered was a handsome, charming 35-year-old man we will call Mark. On our unit, if a patient told their nurse they were actively suicidal, they were placed on a one-to-one observation, meaning a staff member was assigned to be with them at all times to ensure their safety. One day, Mark casually approached his nurse and stated that he was suicidal and needed constant supervision. Even though we strongly suspected he was lying, though you can never be 100% sure, we were required to provide him with a one-to-one. I was the only available staff member and was therefore assigned to him. He asked if I would walk laps around the unit with him. I agreed. As we walked, he asked seemingly harmless questions about my favorite food and holidays I enjoyed. I'm always cautious about sharing personal details, but his questions felt innocent enough. About an hour into our walk, he suddenly commented that he could tell I cared deeply for others. Then, without warning, he slammed his head through a glass window. Blood gushed from his face, and shards of glass were embedded all over his head. We had to rush him to the emergency department by ambulance. 2 days later, he returned to our unit, medically and physically cleared. As soon as he arrived, he walked up to me, casually apologized for scaring me, gave a wink, and walked away. I truly believe he inflicted that pain on himself just to burn that horrific image into my mind, to show me that if he could so easily hurt himself, he was just as capable of hurting others. Story 2. While someone cannot be officially diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, the condition most commonly associated with what people think of as sociopathy, until adulthood, conduct disorder is often the diagnosis given to children who display similar behaviors. While working as a clinical supervisor at a mental health crisis and assessment facility, I encountered a couple who had brought in their 6-year-old son. He was an adorable, soft-spoken, and polite little boy. But when I asked about his history, the parents shared something deeply disturbing. Among several incidents of cruelty toward animals, they revealed that he had harmed their new puppy in an unthinkable way. The injuries were so severe that the puppy had to be euthanized. That case still haunts me. Story 3. I'm a psych nurse, one of my patients, whom I had built a significant level of trust with, once told me about a person he and 2 others had tortured almost to death. I knew about the case because it had made the news. He had served time in jail for it. He went into disturbing details about the torture, which included making hundreds of cuts to the victim's body and subjecting them to an acidic bath. According to him, their reason for doing this was that the victim had harmed a young girl in the neighborhood who had Down syndrome, and this was supposed to be payback. This man stayed on our ward for about a month, repeatedly threatening to harm himself if he was discharged. Over weeks of interaction, I had gained some level of his trust. Eventually, he admitted to me that he had fabricated the story about the victim's crime. There had never been any assault. He had simply disliked the man because of an argument they had years ago, likely drug-related. Story 4. During the day, he was the perfect child, kind, helpful, and well-behaved. But at night, he tormented his foster siblings and even recorded it. He loved being the good kid in the house, always acting innocent while pretending not to understand why one of his foster siblings, Jimmy, would scream and lash out so much. What no one knew was that Jimmy, who was nonverbal and unable to tell anyone, was his chosen target. In front of the foster parents, he seemed like a model teen. He only targeted the child who couldn't speak, ensuring there were no witnesses. No one suspected a thing. That changed when, by sheer luck, a video surfaced. The truth was undeniable. Only then did people believe what had been happening all along. Now he's in jail, but due to his youthful offender status, he won't have a permanent record. He's good-looking, charismatic, and will likely go on to ruin lives. I have no doubt that in the future, he will use his history in foster care to manipulate and pull in someone who thinks he's just a vulnerable soul in need of love, only to torment them next. A word of advice: if someone constantly places themselves in a victim role, run. They don't want help, they want control. When someone is genuinely overcoming trauma, it doesn't look like that. Story 5. My dad is a semi-retired psychologist. Back in the 90s, he worked as the director of psychology for a large housing and treatment facility for individuals with severe mental disabilities. Wanting to expand his practice, he decided to start offering therapy sessions on the side for people without disabilities. Since our house had a separate office with its own entrance, He figured it would be a good setup to see a few patients on weekends. That plan lasted about 3 weeks before he realized he had made a terrible mistake. One day, a new patient, a large man, began having a visible breakdown during a session. He started pacing, growing more agitated with every passing moment. My dad's thoughts immediately went to the fact that his wife and 3 kids were in the house, just beyond the office door, while he was alone in a room with someone who was clearly unraveling. He discreetly positioned himself near the door in case the man tried to leave unexpectedly. The man noticed. He pulled out a gun and said, "Don't worry, if I wanted to hurt you or myself, I would have already used this by now." Using the skills he had developed while working with volatile patients, my dad carefully talked him into putting the gun away. Once the man was calm, my dad escorted him off the premises. After that, he never saw another patient at home again. My mom was furious. Story 6. I've encountered a few disturbing individuals, but the most unsettling one was a former military man. He had served in Iraq in the early 2000s and had taken lives in the line of duty. While he always seemed slightly off, there was one particular story he told me that made me realize just how dangerous he was. He admitted that during his time overseas, he would harm livestock, not because he had to, but because he could. He knew that some families depended on those animals for survival, yet he did it anyway. Even worse, he took pleasure in making starving children fight over small pieces of candy. He would throw it on the ground and watch them battle each other for it, sometimes to the point of serious injury. He described it without an ounce of remorse, as if it were just another story. This man is currently walking free. The second individual I encountered was more of what you'd call a classic sociopath. He had been arrested for drug possession, and during his arrest, he attempted to stab the officers, but ended up stabbing himself in the process. He was incredibly intelligent, but deliberately chose a violent lifestyle. He didn't just sell drugs, he relished the control he had over desperate addicts. His favorite game, making them endure painful or humiliating tasks to earn their fix. He enjoyed the suffering, the desperation, the power it gave him. He once claimed he didn't feel pain, and to prove it, he stabbed himself with a pen, deep enough to draw a significant amount of blood. I watched in shock as he buried the pen into his flesh like it was nothing. Yeah, some people are truly terrifying. Story 7. Honestly, he made me feel trapped, like prey in a room with a predator. As a therapist, you develop a strong client-therapist bond, creating an open, empathetic space. Sessions can become intense and emotional, but in a positive way. With this man, however, it felt entirely different. Instead of connection, I felt cornered, an unsettling, panicked sense of danger. He had no remorse. He would slip in statements clearly meant to impress or intimidate me, then seem irritated when I didn't react, though internally I was. I don't fully recall his name or appearance, and I wouldn't share it even if I did. On the outside, he looked completely normal, even somewhat likable. But the more I spoke with him, the more I sensed something profoundly empty beneath the surface. At one point, he casually admitted to harming his partner, right in front of them. He spoke about it the same way someone might admit to forgetting to turn off a light. As a trainee, I should not have been working with domestic violence cases. Those were supposed to be referred to experienced specialists. Yet here I was, listening to him describe an extreme reaction to a minor accident, one that could have happened to anyone. The way he mentioned it, almost as if it was an afterthought, disturbed me even more than the act itself. His expression seemed to say, "Why am I even mentioning this? This isn't important. I'd rather be talking about myself," as if what he had done to his partner was barely worth acknowledging. I remained calm, nodding, while, out of sight, I drew a giant exclamation mark in my notes. I made it through the session, then immediately reported him to my supervisor. He was reassigned to a different counselor. I've never been so terrified of someone based purely on a feeling. Story 8. They arrived at the hospital after making a pact with someone to end their lives together. The other person followed through. They did not. At first, they seemed genuinely devastated, expressing deep guilt over what had happened. But it was all an act. During their inpatient stay, they attempted to manipulate another patient into forming a similar pact. Thankfully, that patient reported it. When we looked into their history, we discovered that they had done this multiple times before. Their pattern was clear. They would get admitted to psychiatric units just to find vulnerable people to target. Legal action was being considered, but at the time of admission, It was unclear whether they would be held responsible. Part of the reason they were admitted in the first place was that they claimed to be suicidal over the possibility of facing charges. Our treatment team remained in frequent contact with law enforcement, especially after we realized they were preying on other patients. In the end, we pursued court-ordered treatment and discharged them to the care of a family member. I don't know if they were ever formally charged, but I certainly hope they were. In my mind, manipulating vulnerable people into ending their lives is just as awful as taking a life directly. In at least 3 other instances, their intended victims survived, and we only learned about those cases later from family members. The farthest they got before being caught was convincing someone from New York to meet them in Ohio to go through with it together. The only reason they got caught this time was because their most recent victim did not go through with it and told us what was happening. Ironically, when they were first admitted, we all felt sorry for them. We thought they had simply backed out of a pact and were now being unfairly scrutinized. I had even worked with them in group therapy. At first, they seemed intelligent, charming, and genuinely engaged in treatment. One of my colleagues, a forensic psychologist, had them on her individual caseload, and even she was deceived. It wasn't until we discovered their actions on the unit that everything unraveled. I used the term sociopath initially, but technically, that's not a clinical diagnosis anymore. They likely had antisocial personality disorder, but they refused to undergo formal testing after being confronted by the treatment team. Though I don't specialize in psych evaluations, I was asked to conduct an informal assessment since I had previously built a rapport with them. That conversation remains one of the most unsettling experiences of my career. I've worked with individuals suspected of serious crimes, including homicide, and I've dealt with people in severe psychotic states. But the way this person shifted their demeanor in that moment chilled me to my core. It was the only time I ever felt genuinely afraid of someone I was speaking to. Story 9. I've been a licensed therapist for nearly 3 years now, but I've been seeing clients with an intern license for about 5 years. The vast majority of my clients have been on probation or parole and have had a wide range of mental health conditions, including Antisocial Personality Disorder, ASPD. My mentor once described people with ASPD like this. It's in the eyes. They have shark eyes, cold and predatory, like they're staring right through you, searching for your weaknesses to exploit. Having worked with several individuals with this diagnosis, as well as those with its adolescent precursor, conduct disorder, I have to say, that description is pretty accurate. People with ASPD are some of the most manipulative individuals I've encountered, and many of them enjoy it. To them, manipulation is almost a game, a side activity they indulge in while working toward whatever goal they have, even if that goal is as simple as appearing normal. And let me tell you, they are good at it. Outsmarting someone with ASPD at their own game is nearly impossible because they've been playing it their entire lives. Since most of my clients are court-ordered, their manipulation often centers around hiding what they're actually doing, whether it's continuing a cycle of domestic violence, substance use, or some other violation of their release conditions. Some are more impulsive than others, but they all share that same unsettling gaze. Edit. I've received some comments about this post being irresponsible or stigmatizing toward mental illness. Let me be clear, this is not a diagnostic indicator of ASPD. I do not diagnose people based solely on their eyes. I use a standardized questionnaire based on the DSM-5 criteria for the disorder and cross-reference it with case history from previous treatment providers, probation officers, and parole records. If you think you can diagnose someone just by looking at them, you are absolutely missing the point. In my experience, the shark eyes look is simply a physical tell, one small part of a much larger pattern that includes a lack of empathy, a tendency toward manipulation, sometimes purely for fun, and other behavioral traits. It's something that stands out once you already recognize the full constellation of symptoms. So no, don't go around calling someone a sociopath just because their stare makes you uncomfortable. Story 10. I used to work in a group home for children under 12 who had severe behavioral and psychiatric challenges. I was a floor staff member while in college. Some of these kids had already been diagnosed with Antisocial Personality Disorder, ASPD, though I was always skeptical. After all, that's a heavy label to put on a child. And then I met AP, not his real initials. This boy was 6 years old and beautiful. He was polite, well-behaved, and followed every rule. But many of our residents had a honeymoon period when they first arrived, a few weeks of near-perfect behavior before their true patterns emerged. With AP, that honeymoon period lasted 8 months. None of the staff understood why he had been placed in our facility. His father was absent, his mother was incarcerated, and he had struggled in foster care. But we saw no troubling behavior during those 8 months. He was a perfect child. And then one day, he wasn't. I had taken the kids outside to ride bikes. The moment AP stepped through the door, he sprinted to the backyard, grabbed a kitten, and ended its life. I was horrified. I immediately gathered the other children and brought them inside. When I reported what had happened, AP calmly told the facility manager that he had no idea what I was talking about. He looked so genuinely confused that for a moment, the manager doubted me. I had to retrieve the evidence to prove what had happened. As I did, AP simply watched me, smiling. That was the first oh no moment of several. AP later began instigating aggressive outbursts, knowing that our protocol required us to physically restrain him for 30 minutes. If he remained escalated, the on-call nurse would administer a sedative. AP loved this process. He wanted to be restrained. He even told us his goal was to receive 1 shot a day. During another incident, 2 staff members had to escort AP into a separate room due to a violent outburst. At some point during the restraint, a metal door shut on his foot, causing a deep wound. When the nurse arrived to treat him, AP was laughing, digging his fingers into the cut to make it bleed more. Then he smeared his blood on the wall, like it was paint. Most of the children in our care were wards of the state, but AP's grandparents visited him regularly. The other kids were often jealous of this. AP played on that, pretending not to recognize his own grandparents in front of them. Then later, he would mock the children who never received visitors. When I left the job, he handed me a drawing. It was a typical child sketch of a person, except the eyes were scribbled out and an X covered the mouth. I asked him why he drew me that way. He said, "You don't deserve eyes because I don't like when you see me. You don't deserve a mouth because you say things I don't like." I've worked with hundreds of children with severe psychiatric and behavioral disorders. I love them, but AP still lingers in my mind. Shortly after I left, he was transferred at 7 years old to a more restrictive facility. The last I heard, he became their success story. His mother recovered, he moved back home, and now he supposedly returns to the group home to give motivational talks about how to behave. I really hope that's true. I hope his treatment was successful, but that was one deeply unsettling child, and I have my doubts. ETA. I am not trying to vilify this child. He was very young and in long-term inpatient care. Calling him scary isn't fair. He was very sick. His case just stands out to me as a reminder of how much work still needs to be done in the field of early intervention and psychiatric care. Story 11. I'm not a therapist, but I once counseled a student. She was 15, intelligent, had a solid group of friends, and was into cutesy things. But certain things she said made me suspect something was deeply off about her. She was dating a boy, but admitted she had no feelings for him. She only kept him around because he was useful and did things for her. She gave him nothing in return, and he was visibly upset about it. When I asked if she felt bad for making him sad, she responded, "No. If I make him sad, that's his problem. Why should I care? I don't feel what he feels. It doesn't affect me." When I asked if she felt guilty for using him, she said, "No. He started hanging around me because he likes me. If he likes me, then he should make himself useful. What else is he good for?" A friend's dog had passed away, and she pretended to care because that was what she was supposed to do. In reality, she didn't understand why she was expected to feel anything about it. A teacher had warned a friend to stay away from her, noticing that her facial expressions seemed rehearsed and forced. She was confused by this and asked me, "Doesn't everyone fake their reactions? If someone tells a joke, don't you pretend to laugh? If someone tells you someone died, don't you pretend to feel sorry?" She asked me to explain what genuine emotion and empathy felt like. After I did, she was completely baffled. She had always assumed everyone else was just as disconnected as she was. Story 12. I'm a psychologist working in a correctional facility. I agree with those who mentioned the DSM-5 criteria for antisocial personality disorder. I've seen plenty of cases that fit the description. However, the individuals who truly unsettle me are the unrepentant S offenders. I believe many S offenders suffer from a treatable, though deeply disturbing condition. But the ones who make my stomach turn are those who try to justify their actions. Some say, it happened to me. Others rationalize, it's legal in other countries. And then there are those who flat out blame their victims, insisting their parents should have taught them better. I don't engage in debates with these individuals. There's no reasoning with them, so I typically redirect the conversation and move on. I've also learned that I've encountered true sociopaths when I realize, after the fact, that I've been manipulated. There have been moments when an inmate left my office and I thought, what a nice guy, only to later learn from staff or other inmates who he really was. Story 13. I'm not a therapist, but I am a teacher with a bachelor's degree in psychology, and I'm about to start my master's in counseling. I work in an elementary school and started 3 years ago when the boy in question was in 3rd grade. Even then, I could tell something was off, but I didn't have much interaction with him. By the time he reached 4th grade, I was working more closely with his class and had to deal with him frequently. There was something eerie about him. He mimicked behaviors, but his eyes were empty, cold. When he stared at people, it was as if he were dissecting them. He was extremely manipulative, but thankfully he lacked charm. He was too self-absorbed to fool anyone for long. Violence was a constant issue. He hit and kicked other students repeatedly, receiving multiple write-ups. Worse, he threatened to torture and kill his classmates if they didn't do what he wanted. Things escalated towards the end of 4th grade. During recess one day, a large group of 4th and 5th graders were playing a game when he got out. He snapped, attacking the kids who had tagged him. When I started writing up the incident report, he ran at me. I suppose he assumed that because I'm a 5'5" woman and overweight, I wouldn't be able to stop him. But when he tried to tackle me, I planted my feet and he bounced right off. He then swung at me. The other teachers called for backup while I blocked his punches and kicks. The entire time he screamed explicit details about how he was going to torture me. He wasn't just making threats, he had plans. At one point, when the disciplinary officer restrained him, he looked at me dead in the eyes and said he was going to strangle me with my own intestines. We wrote reports, and he was sent to inpatient treatment. Now he's back in school. He's less violent and no longer makes direct threats, but he's still as manipulative as ever. He scares me. Story 14. I work in a residential substance abuse program. I don't take offense to most clients' behaviors. Many of them were at their worst during addiction and are now trying to improve, whether voluntarily or by court order. I've worked with convicted murderers who were genuinely remorseful, and I had no issue helping them. But one particular client stood out. Someone I strongly believe has antisocial personality disorder. During his intake interview, I could immediately tell he was a skilled manipulator. He mirrored my posture and speech patterns, spoke eloquently, and was incredibly charismatic. But something felt off. I took note and moved on. I needed more data. As time went on, it became clearer. Nothing was ever his fault. His failed relationships, his addiction, his inability to hold a job. He blamed everything and everyone but himself. His excuses were endless. The most disturbing revelation was when he casually mentioned stabbing his own brother. His story: he stole his brother's car in the middle of the night, drove it into a ditch, abandoned it, and then lied about it. When his brother confronted him, he stabbed him for being annoying. He manipulated both staff and fellow clients, though a few of us saw through him. Whenever we called him out in group therapy, he would put on an act but never show genuine remorse. In one session, I confronted him about inconsistencies in his story. That's when he admitted something horrifying. He was HIV positive, which I already knew. He contracted it either by sharing needles or cheating on his partner with someone who did. He found out about his diagnosis months before his partner returned from a trip. He sought treatment, but never told them. Even worse, he revealed that he had been drugging his partner. This person had a family history of meth addiction, but had never used drugs themselves, not even marijuana. He fed them substances without their knowledge for his own sole gratification. His partner suffered severe panic attacks after their encounters, and he convinced them that's all it was, just anxiety. As he recounted this, his entire body seemed to light up. He laughed, saying he couldn't believe they still trusted him. There were other disturbing confessions, but this was enough for me to wish I could warn the world about him. He completed the program by going through the motions. He's now back in the community, and he's still young. I have a terrible feeling that someday he'll take things even further, and I wouldn't be surprised if he kills someone. Story 15. This isn't exactly what you were asking for, but a relative of mine was given an unofficial diagnosis of Antisocial Personality Disorder, ASPD, when she was younger. At the time, doctors told her family they didn't like to officially diagnose someone under 18. As a child, she was extremely manipulative and could switch from acting completely normal to completely cold in an instant. Her parents forced her to go to therapy, but as soon as she turned 18, she stopped attending. Now, as an adult, she lives a relatively normal life. She's still extremely manipulative, but she's also better at hiding it, which makes her come across as charming. She works a regular job, though she switches jobs every year or two, always by choice. Her relationships follow the same pattern. Her boyfriends never seem to last longer than they are useful to her. I don't think she has any real friends. Story 16. I currently work with incarcerated individuals, which means I interact with many people who have ASPD. Here are 3 cases I still vividly remember. I worked at a juvenile detention center for 2 years, one of the most secure facilities in the state for youth offenders. Part of my job involved managing the offender treatment program. This included weekly rounds, individual sessions, and group therapy. Many residents would tell their stories during these sessions, often trying to brag or earn respect. When working with someone with ASPD, the biggest giveaway was the way they spoke, their affect. Some had completely flat emotions, while others smirked or grinned at the most disturbing parts of their stories. The first boy, 16, described how a woman cut his grandmother off in the checkout line at Walmart. He was deeply offended by this, as he had great respect for his grandmother. After telling her he was heading home, he followed the woman outside, forced her into her minivan, and assaulted her in the parking lot to repay her for offending his grandmother. As he described the event, his tone remained emotionless. The only time he displayed any feeling was when he recalled being late getting home, and how disappointed he was that he had upset his grandmother. The second boy, 15, explained that he had been curious about what it would feel like to have power over someone, to see them truly terrified. One day he walked to a neighbor's house, an older woman in her 40s whom he found attractive. Since she knew him, she opened the door without hesitation. That's when he pulled out a knife, forced her into her car, and drove her to a wooded area. He tied her hands and cut her throat, but only superficially. He made sure she wouldn't die because he wanted to watch her fear. Afterward, he simply walked home. When the police showed up at his house, his mother answered the door. According to the report, he casually walked downstairs and said, "They're here for me." The third case still haunts me. A 16-year-old was new to the facility, so I was conducting a pre-group screening session for the offender program. Part of the protocol required him to detail his offenses. His file was extensive, and part of his treatment involved disclosing all victims. At one point, I asked about the age range of his victims. Without hesitation, he told me he had assaulted women as old as 60, including his own grandmother. Then he added, "Some girls weren't even old enough to talk. One was a baby. I wanted to see what her body could handle." His tone never changed as he described moving the infant's diaper aside, using his fingers first, and then other things. He admitted his own body wouldn't fit, so he had to use objects instead. Later, I read the detailed report. A case where an infant, around 8 months old, had required surgery due to the damage inflicted on her. The way he had so casually said, "I just moved the diaper out of the way," will stay with me forever. Story 17. I'm a forensic therapist who works with offenders. Over the years, I've encountered my fair share of sociopaths and individuals with ASPD. My most recent case involved a 17-year-old juvenile who was in trouble for his forceful offense. Of course, he was appealing his case. In fact, he claimed that all of his previous convictions were rigged and under appeal. Because of this, I wasn't allowed to discuss the details of his crimes. Instead, we just talked about life. When someone has multiple violent offenses, you start to question sociopathy. But the moment it became undeniable was when I asked how he made friends. He described an elaborate game in which he positioned himself as the ringmaster, ensuring that everyone around him either obeyed him or turned against each other. He took pleasure in watching people fall into his traps, sometimes destroying long-term friendships just for entertainment. I asked what he did after setting his game into motion. He shrugged and said, "Nothing. Then I sleep with them." On a side note, despite their disturbing nature, I actually find working with sociopaths fascinating. Offenses often require a high level of manipulation, so when a sociopath reaches a certain stage in treatment, they drop the mask. They know that I know what they are, and they don't bother pretending anymore. I once had a group member who was a textbook sociopath. Surprisingly, he gave some of the best feedback to others in the group. While some clients were still trying to be manipulative, he would cut through the nonsense. He once stared another offender down and bluntly said, "Cut the bullsh. These guys don't get paid enough to deal with your lies. Either be honest or go back to prison." In a twisted way, he was the most useful group member we had. Story 18. In the state where I live, to receive any type of mental health services, you need a diagnostic assessment. This means you tell your story, and based on that, you receive a diagnosis. My job is to conduct these assessments and determine what services a person qualifies for. So I hear a lot. One case that stood out was a man who immediately started telling me he had been in and out of incarceration since he was 13. His record included everything from assault to robbery. At 31, he had already spent over 16 years behind bars. Not particularly unusual in my line of work, but the details mattered, so I asked. That's when he started describing the assaults he had committed. He had nearly beaten the mother of his child to death and had zero remorse about it. She's dead now, so it doesn't matter, does it? He was currently facing felony assault charges for nearly killing his toddler's teacher as well. At one point, he paused to drink some cough syrup before casually explaining that he didn't mind prison. He actually liked it because of the fights. He even admitted to instigating them, saying he would spit on people just to start something. Standing at 6 feet 4 inches and over 300 pounds, he rarely lost. His probation officer later confirmed all of this, warning that no provider should ever meet with him alone. True lack of empathy is terrifying. Then there was another guy who frequently told me about his violent dreams and hatred for other people. He described having the same recurring nightmare since his teenage years. 3 mannequins, a blonde, a brunette, and a redhead. In the dream, the redhead would bite off her own fingers, blood spraying everywhere as she laughed. And so he laughed too. Honestly, it's not just the people who do horrifying things that disturb me. It's the ones who are violent and feel nothing about it that are truly unsettling. Story 19. I had a feeling before I even met him. The fact that he had been referred for evaluation after slaughtering an entire family, forcing the parents to watch as he executed their children as punishment for the father losing a bag of hero, told me all I needed to know. The police suspected he was responsible for several other killings as well. He had referred himself, hoping I would diagnose him as unfit to stand trial. He turned out to be fascinating. He was absolutely guilty of everything he had been accused of. He had worked as an enforcer for multiple drug cartels. During our interview, he wasn't concerned about fooling me into thinking he was mentally ill. Instead, he thought simply threatening me would be enough, implying that if he ended up in prison, something bad would happen to me or my family. Ironically, that led to a deeper conversation. I asked him where he had learned to be so intimidating, and that opened a discussion about his childhood. He had grown up in an abusive home, immersed in a violent environment. He admitted that his ability to manipulate and instill fear had been a survival skill. For the first time in his life, he reflected on how this behavior had shaped him and what it had cost him. He was only in his early 20s but had killed at least 6 children and 10 adults since he was 17. He had never loved anyone, never had a real friend. Under all the hostility, he was probably depressed. But most of all, he was afraid. He didn't expect to survive prison. Most of his family members were already incarcerated. In the end, that conversation may have been what helped him the most. He pleaded guilty in court. Later, the prison's forensic psychiatrist reached out to me, saying that our discussion had stuck with him. He genuinely wanted to change. His lawyer, on the other hand, was furious. She blamed me for his crisis of conscience and for the fact that she didn't get paid. Story 20. I work primarily with adolescents in group homes. One particular kid stood out, not because he was violent, but because he was quiet. He didn't understand social norms or rules. He would interrupt conversations at odd times, force his way into discussions, and had no real sense of how others thought or felt. He played games in therapy, not actual games, but psychological ones. He wanted to learn how to mimic emotions, how to blend in. Eventually, he got good at it. He successfully completed the program, graduated out of the system, and transitioned back into the community. A few months after he left, I heard about an incident involving his family. They had been driving down the highway when he suddenly grabbed their dog and threw it out of the moving vehicle. No emotion, no remorse. He had learned how to appear normal, But that part, compassion, never stuck. During his intake interview, it had already been clear that he struggled with not knowing how to act. And after the incident, his focus wasn't on what he had done, it was on how to make sure he didn't get caught next time. Story 21. I'm a psychiatric RN at a state facility. One of my most memorable patients came in frequently due to self-harm. He would mutilate himself for attention and sympathy. At first, his diagnosis was more in line with severe borderline personality disorder. He had removed one of his own testicles and permanently mangled his thumb. But then, he started hurting other people. And he liked it. During his last admission, before being transferred to the forensic unit, he had been living at home with his parents and their small dog. His father had recently undergone major surgery and had a large abdominal scar. One night, the patient made his decision. He grabbed a shovel, eviscerated his father, leaving his intestines spilling onto the floor. Then, for good measure, he used the same shovel to decapitate the family dog. When he was brought in, strapped to a restraint chair, he was grinning ear to ear. Wow, that was marvelous. Story 22. There's a father of one of my child clients whom I strongly suspect has antisocial personality disorder. At first, he comes across as extremely charming, improbably well-educated given the environment where I work, and completely deferential until he's not. When that shift happens, he becomes challenging, trying to seize control of the interaction. He presented a very skewed version of the child's history, conveniently omitting a major factor. He spent about half of the intake asserting that the child's mother was unstable, incapable of parenting, and actively using drugs. While she did have a history of substance abuse, she was in treatment. When I spoke with her separately, she revealed a very different story. She stated that the child's father had been physically abusive to her throughout their relationship and continued to exert control over her even after their separation. He prevented her from seeing one of their children, took her to court repeatedly for custody, and even reported her for child abuse. She also brought in documented proof, his extensive criminal record, which included multiple counts of fraud, theft, and assault. Unsurprisingly, he had never mentioned any of it. Relationally, he was incredibly skilled at building rapport and adjusting his manner of speaking to align with mine, showing clear intelligence and at least some exposure to psychological terminology. But there was a calculated nature to our interaction that unsettled me. I couldn't shake the feeling that every moment he spent talking to me was carefully measured and deliberate, like he was playing a game only he knew the rules to. Story 23. I used to work with a teenage girl who was on the spectrum. My role was as an independent living skills specialist, which meant I would be with her after school, making sure she did her homework, did her laundry, and handled basic responsibilities. She was incredibly smart and hyper-focused on specific interests. As long as she was doing what she wanted, when she wanted, things went smoothly, which was almost never. She was taller and physically larger than me, and she would try to use that to intimidate me, something that worked on her parents, but not on me. I often tried to reason with her, hoping to get her to understand or care about other people's feelings. It never worked. I saw her fabricate terrible stories about things her parents or sibling had supposedly done, claims I knew for a fact were untrue. It got so extreme that at one point, her own parents told me that if I ever felt unsafe, I should call the police on their daughter. They weren't being dramatic, they were genuinely afraid of her. At times, she could be lovely and funny, but other times, the things she said and did unsettled me to my core. That was a couple of years ago. I truly hope that family is doing okay. Story 24. Obligatory, not a therapist disclaimer. I work as security at a hospital and we see all kinds of psychiatric patients. Thankfully, we're just a holding and transfer facility for cases like that. But one patient in particular left me completely shaken. I can't go into too much detail due to confidentiality laws, but this guy had just assaulted his mother, who later died from her injuries, I was told. Instead of taking him to jail, the local sheriff's office brought him to us for evaluation and placement. I'll never forget the way he looked at me. Even before I knew why he was there, something about him put me on edge. Outwardly, he seemed polite, charming even if you only listened to his words. But his body language and his eyes didn't match. At all, his eyes were empty, devoid of emotion. His smiles never reached them. And worst of all, you could feel him watching you, sizing you up, searching for weakness. Every interaction with him made my skin crawl. It was like being stalked by a predator. If you've ever been in a violent situation, you know that distinct feeling of impending danger right before something erupts? He carried that energy with him the entire time. He wasn't overtly aggressive, but it was there, just under the surface. The tension was unbearable. He was only there for a few hours before the staff told the police, in no uncertain terms, that he couldn't stay. No one felt comfortable having him in the building. I'll never forget that experience for as long as I live. It was like staring into the abyss, only to realize the abyss was staring right back. Story 25. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I've seen it mentioned that sociopaths don't typically seek therapy, and while that's generally true, I've witnessed incredibly sociopathic behavior firsthand. It's most noticeable in the husbands I work with. Men raised to believe their household is their kingdom and that everyone in it exists to serve them. It usually takes about 10 minutes to distinguish between an angry spouse who simply struggles with communication and someone who truly lacks the ability or the will to empathize. One case stands out. During our third session, a man's wife broke down, sobbing as she described how he constantly talked down to her. After she composed herself, I asked them both what goals they had for therapy. Without hesitation, he responded, "I want to work on understanding why my wife makes such stupid fucking decisions." She burst into tears again and ran out of the room. He just looked at me with this expression like, "Women, right?" He had no concept that what he said was hurtful. Or maybe he knew and just didn't care. Either way, it was chilling to witness. Spoiler alert, she left him 2 weeks later. Not long after, he threatened to shoot her if she left. Fortunately, she got out safely and is doing much better now. Story 26. My middle brother used to burn my baby brother with lit cigarettes. He also forced him to eat cat feces off crackers. He would hold him down and spit in his mouth. My little brother was only 4 years old and my middle brother was 12. When our mother was told about it, she did nothing. When he was 13, my middle brother set his own dog on fire. He tortured any animal he came across. As an adult, he would repeatedly drown and resuscitate my mother's cats whenever he was alone with them. He also poured bleach into his fish tank simply because he was tired of taking care of them. During a visit to our eldest brother, who owned a beautiful German shepherd, the dog woke him up in the middle of the night. Annoyed, he kicked the dog in the stomach. When my older brother woke up, he found his pet near death. A trip to the vet confirmed the dog had twisted bowel syndrome. He had to be put down. The damage my middle brother caused to our family is irreparable. He thrived on stirring up conflict, fabricating events that never happened just to create chaos. He even claimed to have a book recording everyone's supposed transgressions and would use it as leverage anytime someone called him out on his behavior. I could go on, but I'm sure you get the idea. We're all in our 50s now, and no one has anything to do with him. To this day, he still doesn't understand why. Story 27. I'm not a therapist, but I was diagnosed with ASPD as a teenager. I still believe it was a misdiagnosis, and so does my current therapist. While I share some traits with the disorder, I do have empathy and experience emotions. My diagnosis now is schizoid or schizoaffective, though I don't have hallucinations or delusional beliefs. As a baby, I was averse to touch. I never wanted to be held, and that aversion continues to this day. As a child, I was a huge bully, but then one day I just stopped and became a loner. I don't really know why. I remember enjoying hurting other kids, and then one day I didn't anymore. Teenage me was manipulative, self-destructive, and egocentric. I alternated between feeling completely void of emotion, being terrified of that void, and trying to fill it with pain, either mine or someone else's. I was intelligent, not that it helped me much. I would argue with my high school teachers until I either wore them down or made them angry enough that I felt I had won. Then I got to college and discovered that the game of ego can't be played with people who refuse to engage. I didn't realize that until I had thrown away a full-ride scholarship, along with several $1,000s of my own money. The biggest shift for me happened when I had my daughter. For the first time, I felt a pure, unforced bond of love. Before that, I had only experienced love out of obligation, fear, or routine. It always felt hollow, like it wasn't what it looked like in movies. I think that disconnect made me dissociate from the feeling altogether. With my daughter, it was different. I wanted to protect her in a way I had never even considered for another human being. Up until that point, if I had somehow discovered that everyone else in the world was just a simulation or a figment of my imagination, I would have felt satisfied that I was right. But she was different. She was the first person who truly felt like she was alive, just like me. Story 28. During college, I interned at a nonprofit that worked to keep children with their parents. We helped parents find jobs, administered drug tests for court-ordered cases, and provided education and daily home visits. One case involved extreme abuse by a stepfather toward two little boys, a 2-year-old, not his biological child, and a 6-month-old, his son. The children were removed from the home after the mother was found unconscious from a beating, and the stepfather had strung the 2-year-old up by his neck on a ceiling fan as punishment for crying. Fast forward years later, the mother regained custody and the stepfather was in prison, serving a 20-year sentence. The boys were now 12 and 10. We hadn't been working with them for a while when the mother called, saying she needed help. Her 12-year-old was violent and out of control. She explained that he kept putting his younger brother in dangerous situations, telling him to grab things out of the oven with his bare hands, taking him deep into the woods and leaving him there, and generally displaying cruel behavior. There were also issues at school, including aggression and bullying. We implemented a reward system, allowing the boys to choose their own incentives. The prizes started small but increased as they completed chores and went without getting in trouble at school. Both boys wanted to play baseball that spring, so we made that their ultimate reward. If they stayed out of trouble for a month, they could join the local league. A month went by. Both boys behaved perfectly. They did their chores, stayed out of trouble, and followed every rule. To celebrate, we showed up with baseball equipment, gloves, balls, a bat, and cleats. Their mother was so excited about the improvement that she also got them a 6-week-old kitten as a reward. The next day, the 12-year-old tied up his younger brother and forced him to watch as he beat the kitten to death with the baseball bat. When their mother came home, she found him sitting in front of the TV, completely calm, still covered in the kitten's blood. Meanwhile, the 10-year-old was hysterically crying. She immediately called us. We had to place him in a psychiatric unit. While there, he admitted that he was disappointed because killing something wasn't as fun as he had expected it to be. The last update we received was that 3 years later, he was still in the unit, with no signs of improvement. He was, without a doubt, the most terrifying child I've ever met. Story 29. I work at an intermediate care facility for adults with developmental disabilities. The facility serves individuals who are extremely difficult to care for in a community setting. Most of the residents are either medically fragile, exhibit violent behavior, or are legal offenders who are not incarcerated due to their disabilities. We had one resident who, for the most part, seemed completely functional. He was intelligent and could have easily held a job and lived independently. Almost all the time, he was friendly, cooperative, and didn't cause trouble. Then one evening, while staff weren't looking, he approached another resident, someone physically incapable of defending himself, held his eyes open and poured chili powder into them. Story 30. I'm not a therapist, but I once lived with a sociopathic roommate. At first, I felt bad for her because she always claimed that people were out to get her. She said she had been assaulted multiple times, and I believed her. I felt horrible for her. Over time, I realized she was incredibly manipulative, and she had a deep need for revenge. The truly disturbing part is that she works at a women's health and STD testing center, where she has access to sensitive patient information. One day, she told me that a classmate from college had assaulted her. To get back at him, she used the records from her job to track him down and reported his entire family to immigration authorities. She has also falsely accused multiple people of assault, always targeting those who saw through her manipulative ways and tried to distance themselves. Now she's suing a man, once again claiming he assaulted her. I can only hope that she gets investigated for her actions because the amount of damage she has done with access to patient information is terrifying. Story 31. I'm not a therapist, but my mother used to work in group homes for children in the foster system during the 70s and 80s. These were homes where kids stayed before being placed in foster care. She once told me about a boy no one was allowed to be alone with. At first, she thought her coworkers were exaggerating. They weren't. One day during playtime, he suddenly wrapped his hands around her throat and whispered, "This is what it would feel like to kill you." He was only about 4 or 5 years old. I don't know what happened to him after my mom left that job, but this case always stuck with her. She had encountered children who had suffered horrific abuse, things beyond what most people could imagine. Yet this was the one that shook her the most. And my mother is the kind of person who is unshaken in 99% of situations. Story 32. My mom runs a high-security psychiatric ward. I'm not sure what her role is now, but the last time we spoke, her job involved evaluating incarcerated individuals to determine whether they were fit to return to society or should be placed in her ward. These were people who had committed horrific crimes: murder, assault, arson. The ironic part? My mom herself displays so many traits of a sociopath. She is the most manipulative person I've ever met, completely cold and unfeeling. She always said, "Once you turn 16, I'll kick you out because legally I'm no longer obligated to support you." And sure enough, she did. I had caught her cheating on her third husband, so she turned everyone against me and kicked me out. Truthfully, I was too scared to speak up. I had been raised by my grandparents and only lived with her during my teenage years. But I couldn't go back to them either. My grandfather had burned down our home, ended up in prison, and my grandmother, suffering from undiagnosed dementia, was in a refuge. So at 16, I found myself in homeless shelters, places that were absolutely not safe for someone as young and naive as I was. I dealt with everything from terrifying pimps to drug addicts breaking into my room. Despite everything, I always wanted to be in my mother's life. Even when I was pregnant and nearly died from complications, my father, who lived in another country, had to beg her to come see me. I tried so hard to maintain a relationship with her, but she always found an excuse to cut me off. If she talked to me, she would disown my brother and vice versa. She was never there for anyone. When my grandmother passed away 2 years ago, she didn't show up. When my grandfather died a year later, she ignored it. These were the people who raised her children, and they spent their last years relieved that she was gone. She had manipulated every single person in our family, and if you were no longer useful to her, you were discarded. A few years ago, I finally had a breakdown. When my grandmother died, I lost myself completely, but I came back. I got therapy. When I reached out to my mother, she told me not to. She admitted that I would never get what I wanted from her. "It's been 15 years, she said. "You need to move on. It's hard to accept that your own mother never loved or wanted you, but I've built a life with people who do. My brother and I are closer than ever, and I've lived in the same country as my father for the past 8 years. We have a good relationship." Story 33. I'm a psych nurse, and over the past 9 years, I've encountered many sociopaths in our unit, but only one truly stands out. He was a white male in his 40s, and at first glance, there were no obvious signs of psychosis. However, his full-body tattoos, including offensive ones like SS symbols and swastikas, were an immediate red flag. When I looked into his history, I found out he had worked as a bouncer and had once thrown a 20-year-old patron through a second-story plate glass window. The victim died on impact with the sidewalk below. He was convicted of manslaughter but was out of remand in no time. When I first met him, he was mostly nonverbal, but when he did speak, it was chilling. He's one of only 2 people I've ever genuinely feared, and at the time, I was 6 feet tall and 250 pounds. I didn't like making eye contact with him, but I forced myself to do it. Showing weakness wasn't an option. His eyes were completely empty, like a soulless void. It sounds cliché, but there's no better way to describe it. When he was angry, he didn't show it. No expressions, no raised voice, just a blank, unsettling stare. I avoided pushing him too hard, worried he might lash out in some violent way. Eventually, we established a level of mutual respect. He even gave me a warning that the belongings he had brought in contained used needles infected with Hep C from his IV drug use. When we discharged him, I told my colleagues that he would kill someone again. And he did. About a year later, I read about how he went to a high-ranking crime boss's home, knocked on the door, and shot him 3 times when he answered. I wasn't surprised. I just really hope he stays in prison this time. He belongs there. Story 34. I'm not a psychologist, but I'm 95% sure my brother-in-law has ASPD. A little background: he's incredibly intelligent, acts much older than he actually is, and comes across as overly charming. When I first met him, I honestly thought he was gay because of how nice he was to me. He complimented my shoes, my outfits, my cooking. But then I realized that's just how he interacted with everyone. And after a while, I just wrote him off as a fake, insincere person. Still, compared to the rest of my husband's awful family, he was someone I actually looked forward to seeing. Fast forward to his second Christmas with his in-laws, and my first. My father-in-law sent out a Google Doc where everyone could list gift ideas. I kept it simple: I just asked for a Barnes& Noble gift card. I don't care much about material things. And since these were my new in-laws, I didn't expect anything anyway. But my brother-in-law, he listed a ridiculous number of things. I want this shirt with a specific type of pocket, these pants, but only if they come back in stock before December, and on and on. He even sent my mother-in-law a long list of snacks he liked. To be fair, she did ask both of us, but still. Then he insisted we go sledding a few days before we all flew into town. My father-in-law was like, there's no snow and there won't be this whole week. Just bizarre, entitled behavior. And mind you, financially, my husband and I make well over 6 figures, while my brother-in-law and his wife were expecting a baby, and he had no plans to work because he was getting his master's degree. Now here's where I became convinced he was truly disturbed. He broke his infant son's leg, ankle, and 4 ribs, 10 bones in total. My nephew was only 2 months old. This happened nearly a year ago, and thankfully the baby is okay and starting to walk now. But it gets worse. At first he was charged with 2 felonies. He still hasn't been formally sentenced because the case is so complex. But despite the overwhelming evidence, his entire family, his parents, siblings, and even their spouses, believed he somehow broke his own child's bones by accident. That's how manipulative he is. Even people who knew him well were in shock when they found out. Since then, the charges have increased to 7 felonies as more evidence has come to light. And from what I can tell, family support for him has started to dwindle, though no one openly talks about it. Meanwhile, my sister-in-law has stayed with him and is now pregnant again. I really hope the professionals evaluating him can see him for what he truly is. At this point, I'm not even sure it's just ASPD. He's a deeply unsettling person, and the scary thing is, you never really know how dangerous someone is until they commit a violent crime. Story 35. I work with individuals who have dual diagnoses, both special needs and mental illness, in a group home setting. One of my clients had been diagnosed as a pedophile, among other conditions, but those aren't relevant to this story, and was receiving chemical castration injections due to past problematic behavior. When he experienced intrusive thoughts, we worked through them together, and he always seemed genuinely distressed about it. He would act as if he was upset with himself, as if he truly couldn't control them and hated having those thoughts. One day he went AWOL. My coworker chased him down the street, but eventually lost him. Because this was a public safety concern, we had to call the police. While my coworker made the call, I searched his room to see if there were any clues about where he might have gone. What I found instead made me sick. Hidden among his belongings was a notebook filled with detailed descriptions of his fantasies. Graphic, disturbing entries about what he wanted to do and how those thoughts made him feel. The way he presented himself to his treatment team was completely different from what he had written. Eventually he was found, and the situation ended without incident. He still lives in that facility. I, however, moved on not long after. That experience taught me one thing. I have absolutely no sympathy for anyone capable of thinking those things about a child. Story 36. I have worked in multiple inpatient psychiatric facilities, including a long-term court-committed facility. Most of the patients were brought in involuntarily, so it wasn't uncommon to encounter sociopathic individuals. One patient in particular stood out. His pattern of behavior was clear. He would single out a staff member, befriend them, and then use his charm to manipulate them into bending the rules, granting him special privileges and making exceptions. On the surface, it seemed harmless, but it was all part of a calculated agenda. Once he had established trust, he would escalate his requests, trying to convince staff members to break the rules in ways that could get them fired. If they refused, his demeanor changed completely. He would become furious, hitting walls, making threats, intimidating nurses, and even turning other patients against the staff. When he realized that a particular staff member had reached their limit and wouldn't cave to his demands, he would simply move on to the next person, starting the cycle all over again. There was never any genuine connection. Every interaction was strategic. Every relationship a means to an end. I was one of the staff members he targeted. At first, I thought we had mutual respect, but that changed when he tried to convince me to look the other way while he dealt with a conflict with another patient. When I stopped him from attacking that person, he was outraged. Administration had to pull me off the floor entirely while he was admitted because another staff member overheard him trying to recruit another patient to help him take care of me. Maybe it was just an empty threat, but in that environment, we already get hurt enough. I wasn't about to take any chances with someone like him.